All right, so let's pick it up where we left off last time. I didn't get through very much of book 1, and I want to get through that and into book 2, and then even into book 3 today. We left off noting the various conventions of the epic that Milton was following, and by following them, he was not only demonstrating that he was following or writing an epic, but that he was engaging with the subject matter of the epic. And one of the last epic conventions I noted was that epics allude to foregoing epics and are in a dialogue with them and always seek in some way to outdo their predecessors. And in the case of Milton, his claim to superiority is a theological one. So the subject matter of his epic is not merely the greatness of the Roman Empire or the greatness of Achilles or Odysseus. It's the greatness of God and the inscrutability of his ways, and how unlike classical heroism, Christian heroism is. How unlike it is. So one of the reasons that the debate exists over who Milton's hero is because his hero doesn't really follow a normal pattern. It just doesn't. Not only in the construction of the epic, but even in the presentation of what constitutes heroism. So we begin here, for instance, with something that we don't have in any of the foregoing epics. We have like an anti-hero figure, Satan, being given front stage, like he's being given a central role right from the outset. And his speeches are magnificent in some ways, and some have thought, and the Romantics were the first that presented this view, that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it, and presented Satan in such a magnificent way that we couldn't help but sympathize with him. Even if we're not in agreement with everything that he presents, we still think he's a great figure. And this was a pretty common view for the Romantics. They didn't all hold it, but they all thought that Milton's Satan was magnificent in some way. I don't think he's Milton's hero, but that's the case. It's because of the placement in the epic and the greatness of the figure portrayed. That's not going to bother Milton if his notion of heroism is different than the classical epic, but still. But I left off with talking about the geography of hell, as it were, and I said to you and pointed to the lines 62, 63, and so forth, the description of hell, a dungeon horrible on all sides around, as one great furnace flamed, yet from those flames no light, but rather darkness visible, served only to discover sights of woe. Regions of sorrow, doleful shades where peace and rest can never dwell. Hope never comes that comes to all. That description there of hell, I noted last time, Milton's describing a place that is utter darkness. And the utter darkness of hell shows that it is the place where God is not present at all. Because God himself is light. And in the third book, which we'll come to, he hails God as light. And explicitly invokes him as light. Jesus is the light of the world, right? But God and light is an implication of his goodness as well. It's a symbolic representation of it. It's something that allows us to see. It allows us to take delight in some ways, because God himself, his presence is delightful. In hell, on the other hand, there is no light. And it's a place that is a place of agony and torment. On the other hand, it's not particularly torturous if you can't be tortured by it, and you can't be tortured by the sights of it if you can't see anything. So Milton's describing what hell looks like, while at the same time saying there's no light there. So it's not, he says it's no light, but rather darkness visible. And I also said last time I left off that this accords with his Augustinian view of evil. When I say Augustinian, I'm talking about St. Augustine, the church father, and his portrait of evil. And his portrait of evil is not one that would be one we would naturally consider, to be honest, which is that the view that Augustine puts forward, and he does it in a book called the Enchiridion, and elsewhere, but this is the main place he puts it in, is that evil actually does not exist. It is what is called the privation of the good, or the privatio boni. That's the Latin term. Bonus being good. Boni, privation of the good. The absence of the good, a lack of goodness. So how do you define evil? Well, it's a lack of goodness. That's what it really is. But it's not a thing unto itself. If it were, then we would have a principle in the world which was totally antithetical to God and yet existed apart from God, against God, in which case we have a dualistic cosmos, in which case we're stuck in the Manichaean heresy that Augustine spent a great deal of time combating, himself being at one point a Manichaean student. So he thought that there was good and evil, and they're at war in the world. And sometimes it looks like good is prevailing, and other times evil does, but ultimately there's no end to their combat, and that's the natural way of looking at the world, I think. There's a perception there is evil in the world. I mean, Jordan Peterson in our day is getting notoriety because he's simply observing that evil is there. And people are surprised because nobody had been talking about evil for a very long time. And he's saying, no, not only is it there, it's not out there, it's in there as well. You also are evil. You have a capacity for evil which is so deeply rooted in you that it's the only thing that can explain people's terrible conduct. When he says that, he might sound out of step with our days, but he's not out of step with the history of how Christians have looked at the world, certainly. But he's presenting it in Manichaean, dualistic ways. I have to say that he's talking about it as a positive thing. There is such a thing as evil. Whereas the Augustinian view is that evil is the absence of a good. It's a deficit of something that's positive. Yes?
Would you say there would be a healthy balance between those two views that could
No. But there's a temptation to, and the way we experience it as something real, that can't be denied. But to acknowledge it as having that is an intellectual disaster, because it diminishes the goodness of God and it magnifies the evil of those that oppose him. It means that God's no longer God, first of all, and secondly, it really doesn't ever define, well, what exactly is evil? What is evil then? And you when you come to define it, well, it's opposed to the good. But that's not a definition. It's just what it isn't. Yeah.
So then would you say that everyone who came before Augustine that didn't subscribe to this, I guess, way of looking at it would be heretical in some way?
Well, I'm not sure that they would, because sometimes definitions arise to deal with what is becoming a problem, and others could have articulated something like this before him, but not without the strong opposition of a Manichae who was saying this is the way it is. And then in terms of Christian theology, well, this is an issue that the church needs to address. What is the correct way of understanding evil? What's the correct way? I mean, one of my colleagues here has written books on evil and the problem of evil and different views on evil. So I'm saying there's more than two, obviously, but roughly speaking, either it exists or it doesn't exist. In this case, it doesn't exist. And that affects the portrait, to bring it back to this, it's not a theology class here, but a literature class, that affects Milton's portrait of evil and portrait of the underworld, or rather of hell. It's a place where there is no light, but rather darkness visible. Now, even Satan, who is evil, an evil agent, nonetheless, he exists. So he is not the representation of evil per se. He acts in an evil way. His evil is in relation to God, but he is not, in a sense, the principle of evil. If you take it in a strict sense, he does not represent evil. His actions are evil. His attitude is evil. He wants everything that God isn't. That's what he wants, and he, to some degree, wants nothing, because there is nothing that is good other than God, ultimately. He wants all the benefits without God. That's not an option for him. But in a sense, Satan, in Milton's portrait, he is still a creature of God. And in that sense, he still has goodness in him, because he is the goodness of existence. It's a philosophical way of looking at it. That doesn't mean he's not acting contrary to God's purposes, or at least he thinks he is, because what we're going to find when we come to book 3, and we hopefully will get that here, God is allowing him to do this and predicting it's what he's going to do, and to some degree is involved in having it happen, which creates a serious conundrum. Is God the author of evil? Is God responsible for what Satan does because he allows him to do it? He brought about the fall. God foresees it's going to happen. He allows it to happen. Is then God not responsible for the evil act? Those are the questions that arise out of it. On the other hand, if he's not aware of it, it's the fact that it's going to happen. Is he God at all? Is he omniscient? So you've got a conundrum no matter how you come about it. Either God doesn't know what's going to happen, or he can't stop it, or he won't stop it. Those are the apparent problems. Milton will address those in a literary way. But they're hard issues to solve, and I don't think they can be solved philosophically. Yes?
Is there ever a point where your actions become who you are? So is the point where the devil decides that he's going to continue on the path of evil to the point where he just is evil? He's personified evil because all
he becomes, yes, so yes. So actions, to some degree, first of all, they're an expression of your character, but they also are an intensification of your character. You become more like what you are by acting that way. So we're told not to be hypocrites. We're told not to be actors. Jesus doesn't want us to be hypocrites. He wants us to be sincere in how we act. So we don't do it for public display. We do it because we do it for God, and so we can do it in secret, right? In Matthew 6. But in another sense, we are to be actors because actually we're supposed to do things, and by doing them, it's changing who we are in our commitment. It demonstrates it. It's just the reason that you do it, which is acting. But the opposite of being a hypocrite is not doing nothing, just sitting there and having no action at all. You have to act. For instance, you're supposed to feed the poor. You're supposed to give alms to them. You're supposed to pray. You're supposed to fast. These are things you're supposed to do. These are actions. When you do these things, it changes who. Not only are you doing a good thing, but it also affects who you are. So yes, the answer is yes. And that's because of the nature of the word. So this word in John's gospel for the word is logos, which is the inner principle of a thing. So the logos of a car engine is the gasoline that explodes and drives it onward. That's the logos of the car, is the fuel that explodes in the engine and drives your car at great speed. That's the inner principle of what makes the car work. That's the logos, the gas. In Hebrew, on the other hand, the word, and this is the word that John's gospel uses for word, logos, from which we also get logical, by the way. So it's also rationality or explanation for it, or the way it works. In Hebrew, the word is davar, with a B. And there, it's not only the word, it also means an event. So when God speaks in Genesis, he says, "Let there be light," and there's light. An event happens. Every time God speaks, an action takes place, an event. And so words have power. They're not just use of language, they do something. So words themselves have actions and consequences in God, but also in people. And so to follow your line of logic there, if Satan pronounces himself the adversary of God, and those are his words and also his actions, that sets off a chain of events that is going to doom him to still more torment. But there's to be an integrity there between the way we speak and the way we act. They're supposed to be one. Most people don't do that. We call that hypocrisy. Satan is the consummate actor. But here he's actually, at least here, when he's talking on his own, he's not acting. He reveals his inner thoughts. When he goes and speaks to the other devils, we will find that he tries to manipulate them. He doesn't tell the whole truth. It's interesting. He never stops twisting. He's the deceiver. Anyway, so he is in the underworld, and we see it, and it's a place where you can't see anything, because that's Milton's portrait of evil. It's a place that, to some degree, cannot is a nothing. But on the other hand, it is a place. Paradox there. It's the place that eternal justice had prepared, line 70, for those rebellious. And then he looks over and he looks at his another next to him in power, line 78, and weltering by his side, next in power and next in crime, long after known in Palestine and named Beelzebub. Sometimes in Christian understandings they're the same figure. Milton differentiates them. To whom the arch enemy, and thence in heaven called Satan, meaning the adversary in Hebrew, breaking the horrid silence, thus began, if thou beest he, but oh, how fallen, how changed from him who in the happy realms of light, clothed with transcendent brightness, didst outshine myriads though bright, if he whom mutual league rather, united thoughts and counsels, equal hope and hazard in the glorious enterprise, joined with me once, now misery hath joined in equal ruin, into what pit thou seest, from what height fallen, so much the stronger proved he with his thunder. And till then, who knew the force of those dire arms? So first comment here, he looks at Beelzebub and he can't recognize him. And that's because of the privation of the good in him. He's changed. He's lost his, because remember, he's an angel. He's a being that looks upon God. He's seen wonderful things, but now he's lost that goodness which God is, and it's affected his appearance. It's a moral violation. First of all, there's a moral rebellion against God, which is a genuine war in heaven, as Milton portrays it. But it's a rejection of God's goodness and a reflection of their privation of goodness, but it's reflected in their appearance as well. So they don't even look anything like what they used to look like. That. This is Satan's comment on Beelzebub, but of course it's true of him as well. He used to be called Lucifer, the bearer of light. Now he's just the adversary, Satan. So how much so? And note the confusion that he presents of this. So much the stronger proved he with his thunder. Until then, who knew the force of those dire arms? Well, I guess this is accurate in one sense, because nobody has dared to fight God, been so idiotic as to attempt the thing. That's true. But in the sense of who knew the outcome, well, if you fight against the omnipotent, who's going to win? I mean, it's an absurd comment. It's a reflection of the confusion within Satan even. But he says, but here's the heroic speech. Yet not for those, nor what the potent victor in his rage can else inflict, do I repent or change. Though changed in outward luster, that fixed mind and high disdain from sense of injured merit, that with the mightiest raised me to contend, and to fierce contention brought along innumerable force of spirits armed that durst dislike his reign, and me preferring. His utmost power with adverse power opposed in dubious battle on the plains of heaven, and shook his throne. I'll stop just for a second here. So Satan claims that it's been an external change to him, but internally nothing has changed. His spirit is unbroken. So there's something glorious in this. He's beaten but not vanquished. When I say glorious, represents human resilience. Remember, he's not a human, but human beings admire a resilient character who won't know he's beaten And there's something of the underdog in him now, fighting against omnipotence and won't stop. So they're very easy to anthropomorphize Satan and present him as this figure of resolve, just like Aeneas was. Pious Aeneas, who also was endured much hardship. Same thing with Odysseus. Right, so they're features of the epic heroes which Satan expresses here in his opposition to God, which might make us think that we were to admire him. And furthermore, then the speech that follows, 105. What though the field be lost? All is not lost. The unconquerable will and study of revenge, immortal hate, and courage never to submit or yield. And what is else not to be overcome? That glory never shall his wrath or might extort from me. To bow and sue for grace with suppliant knee, and deify his power, who from the terror of this arm so late doubted his empire, that were low indeed. That were an ignominy and shame beneath this downfall. Since by fate the strength of gods in this imperial substance cannot fail, since through experience of this great event in arms not worse, in foresight much advanced, we may with more successful hope resolve to wage by force or guile eternal war irreconcilable, and to our grand foe, who now triumphs and in the excess of joy, sole reigning holds the tyranny of heaven. So everything in this is a distortion, by the way, in this statement. It concludes with the idea that God is a tyrant. A tyrant is an unjust ruler. God defines what justice is. How can God be a tyrant? Even if he's all-powerful, he's not a tyrant because he is just. He's also not just the king, he's the creator. So what right does a king have over his subjects? Well, there are limits on it. What right does a creator have over his creation? Well, there are no limits on it. Even in theory, there are no limits on it. In practice, he also happens to be good. Creates things, calls them good, makes them good. He has rebelled against that goodness, so to call God a tyrant is to flat lie. But that's, again, characteristic of him. He goes on, though, right at the outset of that speech, he says that he will never his will will never bend. So he may have lost the field, but he has not bowed the knee. He has not admitted that he is beaten. And he says that to do so would be to deify his power, which is absurd, again, because you can't deify someone who is God. Already, he's not giving him an attribute that he wouldn't have if you didn't worship him. He is God. You don't deify him. You acknowledge his deity, but he's overstating it. To bow the knee to him would be to give him a divinity, which I reject, Satan says. And he goes on to say that he doubted, even when they were in combat, God doubted his empire, thought he might lose, there's no evidence for that whatsoever. Again, in a fight against the Almighty, who do you think is going to win the fight? Would the Almighty have any reason to doubt that he wouldn't be a victor? No, it's part of sin's blindness and Satan's blindness there. But anyway, he goes on with this and he says, now I have a better chance of beating him because now I know how powerful he is. Which is a bad argument once again. It doesn't matter. What we get from Satan is that he is committed to a position and he's committed to arguing it, presenting arguments to support it, irrespective of the reality. So he is Satan. He is the adversary. That much is true. Yes?
So how can we analyze his character without anthropomorphizing?
I don't know. So this is the problem. This is Milton. This is a good question. How do we analyze Satan's character without anthropomorphizing? Even more problematic, how do we analyze God's character without anthropomorphizing? This is a genuine problem. He's also talking about things that he couldn't possibly have seen and there's no scriptural warrant for either, so he's speculating. And for our part, we are judging characters by our human standards. We have to do so. We have no other capacity. We, of course, judge them in accordance with that. So there's a part of us, and critics have looked at this with Satan and said, Satan is a sympathetic figure. So Milton makes him so, and he brings us to have sympathy with him. He draws us to have sympathy with the devil. But he doesn't do it. Here's where the critics diverge from the Romantics. The critics say that he does it in order for us to recognize how committed to evil we are, and then to repent of that. That's one critic's view, at any rate. Stanley Fish in Surprised by Sin.
So the Romantics would reject that it's for the cause of repentance and say that
it's just heroic grandeur, and it's a representation of the greatness of the human spirit, and they'll reject the idea that the theological realities that the Bible affirms are actually anything other than a symbolic representation of psychological states, which is Jordan Peterson's position. So there's something true about them. It's true of human psychology ultimately. So so that's not no truth. There is truth, but really it is just the human truth. It's not really revealing the person of God. It's revealing what our character and nature is like, and that can be seen in the story of the Bible, but can also be seen in various myths. Or watching Disney films, and you can see similar. No, I mean, he does to some degree what I do in my classes. I agree that those stories are to be found there, and there are archetypal myths. There's no doubt about it, and this is in some way similar to those. But the similarity is a correlation, and it's not a causation. That's an unnecessary argument. Yes. Question? Yes.
In line 121, it says
Yes.
to wage by force
Or guile.
Guile external war.
Yes.
Which external war are they referring to?
Well, it's eternal war, but it
Or sorry, eternal.
yeah, it's eternal. That's what he's talking. So the question is, they once had a physical conflict. There was a battle in heaven. We're not going to look at that in books 5 and 6. There's a war in heaven. There's a 3-day war. They bring out cannons, among other things. I mean, it's sort of comical because the cannonballs go right through the angels, and then the hole closes over again, because angels are immortal again, so you can't kill them. So what's the point in having a big fight, right? You can't be. Anyway, he portrays that, but here the war is it going to be through a direct physical battle, conflict, or is it going to be through another means? And he's already tipping his hand where it will be. It'll be by guile. Guile is by deceit. Will it be to trick them, deceive? And that is the means. But they're about to have this debate in hell amongst the angels that have fallen. What are we to do now? And one of the angels wants to go right back at him. Never submit. Let's go back at him right away. Yeah, the thunderbolts have stopped. Let's storm the barricades and go right at him. And the others are, that's not a very good idea. Let's not do that. Another one wants to stay down in the underworld and look for gold. Let's dig down here. This looks like a place Mammon thinks it's a great idea. Let's mine the bottom of all things. There's probably gold there and good things, and we can be happy with life down here because we'll have a lot of gold. It's great. We'll make it like heaven, be shiny and lustrous. And in the end, the proposal that wins Satan's approval, which is Satan's own idea, is we're going to seek to seduce and defraud humanity and get them to fall. That's how we'll poke a stick in God's eye. We can't get him, but we'll get that creature which we've heard he's going to create to rebel just like we did, and we will destroy his work, which will make him very upset.
So basically it's like Satan's plan to trick us into
Correct.
following him instead of God?
Correct. To do just like he did. That's the plan. Yes?
This kind of relates to something that is in book 3.
Okay.
God says is talking to
Yes?
He knows already that Satan's going to reverse things
Yes.
instead of destroying.
Well, I'm going to come to that, but yes.
And I have a big question about Jesus offering himself versus God already knowing that Jesus
Well,
was
put the question on hold till we get to book 3 then. But yeah, I mean, that's why I put it on the materials, because I think it's worth exploring, certainly. But I just wanted to go to one more line here in book 1 before we go to book 2. And I think it's interesting, but that idea of fraud, we're going to deceive Adam and Eve and bring them to fall, that's another way of getting back at God. So we can't beat God directly, let's try it indirectly, by tricking the creature that bears his image, bringing him to sin. But the lines I wanted to look at is line 157 and so forth. Fallen cherub, to be weak is miserable, doing or suffering. But of this be sure, to do aught good never will be our task, but ever to do ill our sole delight, as being the contrary to his high will whom we resist. If then his providence out of our evil seek to bring forth good, our labor must be to pervert that end, and out of good still to find means of evil, which oft times may succeed so as perhaps shall grieve him, if I fail not, and disturb his inmost counsels from their destined aim. But he also states, and I'll come to this in, is it here or is it before? I'm not sure it's here at all in our edition, but he says it's better to rule in hell than reign in hell, or serve in heaven. The mind is its own place, that's it. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. And what matter if I be changed? There you go. Let me put it on the board, because I don't think it's in your book. Is this the region, this the soil, the clime, said then the lost archangel, this the seat that we must change for heaven, this mournful gloom, thank you, for that celestial light, be it so. Since he who now is sovereign, referring to himself, can dispose and bid what shall be right. Farthest from him is best whom reason hath equalled, force hath made supreme above his equals. Farewell happy fields, where joy forever dwells. Hail, horrors, hail, infernal world, and thou, profoundest hell, receive thy new possessor. One who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. And he goes on to say, the Almighty hath not built here for his envy, will not drive us hence. Here we may reign secure, and in my choice to reign is worth ambition, though in hell. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. So this is the famous passage which Milton's Satan claims that his mind has not been changed and that he is in control of his own mind. His body may have changed, but his mind has not been changed. He is in control of his own mind. That's his assertion. What we find, however, is that he has no such mastery over his own mind. He's in torment. He's conflicted, even while he asserts these things. Milton, in his commentary on it, makes that clear. He's roiling in pain. And he's doubting the very things he's saying while he's saying them. And furthermore, his resolve to thwart God is to some degree orchestrating in some way. But above them all, he says the mind is its own place and in itself can make a hell of heaven, a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. So in other words, the mind, there's a wholly internal universe, which is the ultimate reality. What goes on between my ears, that's the reality. my psyche. The Romantics are famous for the psychological turn. Modern psychology and other disciplines arise out of the Romantics' internalization of ultimate reality. But it really begins with Satan's claim. Doesn't matter what reality is. Whatever I think is reality, that is the reality. That's his assertion. And in the end, it's better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Total delusion, one might say, but Satan is a master of delusion. He's not the only one who has made this assertion. He asserts his own identity, if you will, as if he were his own author. He's not his own author. He can't author himself. He's a created being. He's dependent on God even while he says that he's not. This is just pure assertion. It denies God's providence. At least he denies it explicitly. Implicitly, he's fulfilling God's providence. This is the paradox throughout this thing. While the satanic deceiver is acting to deceive everyone else, he is not independent or autonomous as he would like to be. He's actually God's drudge. He's fulfilling God's will because God foresees it and is going to bring good out of it. And he says, well, even if he seeks to out of good bring, or if we try and make something evil and then he makes good out of evil, then we'll make the evil out of good. We'll keep on flipping it back. Well, how can you do that? Since you're not omnipotent. And since you can't fathom God's designs. But the first line is really important as well. To be weak is miserable. Doing or suffering, the one back there. Milton's heroism, I said heroism is a mark of the epic, and Milton's heroism is very different than the classical epic because his heroism entails the weakness of God on the cross, the suffering of the Christ. And through that weakness, the most powerful act in all of human history will take place, which is the destruction of sin and death. Because remember, he dies on the cross and then he rises from the grave, and death thereby is lost its sting. And sin has been put to death with Christ's death. Our death is nailed to the cross because it's our sins that Christ bears, not his own sins. He didn't sin, but he bears our sins and he bears the wrath of God. So it's his notion of heroism then is very different than the classical model of heroism. It's going to be it's not just a little different, it's totally inverted. But note that Satan thinks that to be weak is miserable, doing or suffering. He sounds like a classical hero. They would all agree with this. You don't want to get beaten. You want to be triumphant. You should be acknowledged as such. It's right that it be so. But the theology of the cross is very different than the theology of glory that the world acknowledges. Anyway, was there a comment or a question? Yes, Bob.
I just wanted to note that wouldn't it just be like contradictory itself to call God like the Almighty, to say all of these things and then still call him the Almighty?
Because he will use weakness, but part of his might is to use the opposite of physical strength. He's going to suffer. Remember, the passion of the Christ means the suffering. In his great power, he chooses to exert no power. That's within his power to do so. It's what no powerful person would ever consider. So the question earlier, isn't the problem of anthropomorphizing a real one? It is, because what person would ever do such a thing? If I want to win the fight, I don't do it by saying, beat me. That's not a good way. Or let alone giving myself over to that, which is what he does. Christ was not beaten. He gave himself over to death in his time. He chose when he would die. Not a second before. Right? That was the path that he set himself on and gave himself over to. But there is a weakness there, and yes, it still is in the purview of the Almighty to use that. But it's just that no one with any strength at all would ever choose that path, including a little baby. Babies do not like suffering or being weak. They want to be strong. So that's the problem. We can't understand a God who would do such a thing. It's not a comprehensible act, and it's not something that we can do other than affirm, but not understand. Why would you love sinners? Why would you do so? And why would you suffer for what you did not deserve? There's an apparent injustice in it. Let me come to book 2. Book 2, and I'm not going to do the whole book 2. Sorry, one more question or comment?
I'm just curious, how come that like all like the lines from 190 to like 590 aren't in the book?
In book 2?
Or in book 1?
Oh, in book 1, but not others. Well,
yeah, I'm just curious.
Editorial decision, which doesn't explain your problem. They have a book that is close to 3,000 pages, and they don't want to give more time or more space, more pages to the anthology. That's all. It's an anthology, right? You can buy Milton's entire epic, but this is only an excerpt from it.
Okay, because it just says like Satan summons his army of fallen angels.
Yeah.
And
it skips over it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't present book 3 at all, which we'll come to, which is God and heaven. Heaven's portrayed. Mm-hmm. That's not in your text. And neither is part of book 2, and neither is, so we've got sections of it. And it's an editorial decision. It does beg the question when you come to it, well, why did the editors choose this bit and not this bit?
Yeah.
And I don't like the editor's decisions here, but...
You should have just put it like all in, you think, like, even though it's really long, I guess, but...
Well, it already costs how much, and it's 3,000 pages, and if you add this, then are you just going to make it bigger? Or what are you going to take out then? Now, I'd be happy with that, and I agree with it. Put the whole epic in, but then I'm biased. I think it's the greatest work in the English language, so of course I'm going to say put the whole thing in. Yeah. I'm a Christian furthermore, so you could say I'm further biased on that front, although that would not have been a factor in the decision, to be honest. I just think it is that great. But then you would have to cut out something else that's in here. Now, I would be happy to do that myself, but the editor's not so much. So it's just editorial decision. At least it's in the book.
Yeah.
But what it is cut is significant. Now, one of the things that's cut is not heaven. It will be that, but we're going to find that he also cuts a significant portion of hell, and a really important one at that. Right here. So line 629.
It's book 1?
This is book 2.
Book 2.
And you won't find it in there. This is why it's on the screen, and that's why I put it in the in the course materials. So I'm going to read it here. So what has happened, transpired in the interim, is that Satan, at the end of book 1, builds up a palace called Pandemonium. It's the house of all the devils. So they build a little city in the underworld. This is one of the things they do. And it's like a tower, of course, in pride, representation of the Tower of Babel and so forth. But they also have a little council. And what are we going to do? Are we going to have open war? Are we going to use fraud? And if we do fraud, who's going to go to represent us? And there's a debate. And who wants to go up and go after God the second time? Anyone? Looking around, and there's crickets. Nobody wants to do it. Satan, of course, wants to do it. And so he is nominated, and of course he is willing now that nobody else will. And of course they all applaud him, and what a great character you are, Satan. And now he goes up. Now when he goes up, he doesn't know where he's going, and he has no control over his own body. When I say no control, he's flying, but he's flying like the town drunk. He's wheeling, going from side to side. He's going all over hell. He's bouncing around, hitting this, going up and down and round, and he's trying to get where he's going. He doesn't even know where he's going, because he's in a place that had not existed before God created it for his ilk. So now he's down there, and now he wants to get out. How does he get out? So he's trying to find his way. And as he does, he comes up to these two figures that we're going to meet. And you will find mentioned in James 1, and I believe it's 15, but we'll come to that in a second. But he's going up, and he's going to the gate of hell. There's a gate there. So let me just read first of all. Meanwhile, the adversary of God and man, Satan, with thoughts inflamed of highest design. Put on swift wings, and towards the gates of hell explores his solitary flight. Sometimes he scours the right-hand coast, sometimes the left. Now shaves with level wing the deep, then soars up to the fiery concave, touring high. And now we get an epic simile. As when far off at sea a fleet descried hangs in the clouds, by equinoctial winds close sailing from Bengala or the isles of Ternate and Tidora, where merchants bring their spicy drugs. They on the trading flood through the wide Ethiopian to the Cape, fly stemming nightly towards the pole, so seemed far off the flying fiend. So Satan in this epic simile is compared to a drug trader. Going from India down along the east coast of Africa towards the Cape, and then back up. I remember in Milton's England, there was a lively trade of spices to India, British East India at the time. But here, it's the drugs that he's not just bringing spicy, but drugs. So it's a rather negative comparison. But off he goes, and he flies the flying fiend. At last appear hellbounds high, reaching to the horrid roof, and thrice threefold the gates. Three folds were brass, 3 iron, 3 of adamantine rock, impenetrable, impaled with circling fire, yet unconsumed. Before the gates there sat on either side a formidable shape. One seemed woman to the waist, and fair, but ended foul in many a scaly fold, voluminous and vast, a serpent armed with mortal sting. About her middle round a cry of hellhounds, never ceasing, barked, with wide Cerberian mouths full loud, and rung a hideous peal. Yet when they list, that is, when they heard something, would creep, if aught disturbed their noise, into her womb, and kennel there. But yet there still barked and howled within unseen. Far less abhorred than these, vexed Scylla bathing in the sea that parts Calabria from the hoarse Trinacrian shore, nor uglier follow the night hag when called in secret, riding through the air, she comes lured with smell of infant blood to dance with Lapland witches while the laboring moon eclipses at their charms. Let me continue. The other shape, if shape it might be called, that shape had none, distinguishable in member, joint, or limb, or substance might be called, that shadow seemed. For each seemed either. Black it stood as night, fierce as 10 furies, terrible as hell, and shook a dreadful dart, what seemed his head the likeness of a kingly crown had on. Let me stop right there. A horrible description of 2 awful figures at the gates of hell. Who are these figures? One is presented as a disgusting creature, a woman from the top up, but from thence downward, like a serpent. So she begins with a woman and then scales downward like a dragon or a serpent. And these hellhounds creep into her womb, and they eat while they're there, eat her from the inside, and then the other figure beside her. Now, who are these figures? Well, we'll come to this in a second, and I'll answer that. But the other shape, note the line number and the description. Line 666, 666. And it's a shapeless shape. What's a shape without a shape? I don't know. A ghost, again, there's a visible description. Here's a shape that shape had none. Discernible. Or substance must be called, that shadow seems. He against describing something that's indescribable. This is a sublime passage. In the 18th centuries, they went to this passage regularly, for this is sublime language. He's describing the indescribable. So hell that has no light, but rather darkness visible. This passage describing death. That what is death? Have you ever seen death? You've seen people die. Have you ever seen death? You have not. Do you think death exists? Or is death the absence of life? Is it a privation on life? Would you not talk about death? You would talk about death. Say death is a terrible blight on humanity. Okay, what is death? It's a metaphysical question. Science will not be able to answer this question. They'll say it's the cessation of bodily activities. That's not an explanation for what it is. It's a description of what happens before and after. That's not an explanation. Are we going to acknowledge the existence of death? That begs the question, does death even exist? It seems like life is, and then death means you're no longer. So how do you describe this thing which has all of these features? Well, Milton describes it and uses, again, I think, Augustinian terms. It's a privation of the good, privation of life. It's a horrid figure that's very difficult to describe. He seems to have a head and the likeness of a kingly crown had on as well. It's an as it says here, the description of death is so full of equivocal expressions that it's difficult to visualize them. As soon as you imagine a feature, it's taken away. That's purposeful on Milton's part. He doesn't want you to be able to visualize it. And note how terrifying this is. As soon as you can see something, it's no longer nearly as terrible as it is when you can imagine what it is. Think of how horror films work. When you're in the dark and you're going around the corner and you don't know what's around the corner, but you're terrified about what's around the corner, and then you go around the corner, and even if somebody jumps out at you with an axe or a dagger, well, that's terrifying, but it's not nearly as scary as what you imagine was there. Or think of a Jaws film. The surface of the water, and there's a shark down there, and you got that, and you don't know what's under the water, but something horrible is there. Once it emerges, it's not nearly as scary. It's still scary, but not as scary as it was before it appeared. Mm-hmm. Because now you see something and it's finite, as might have big teeth, but it's not as bad as what you imagined it could be. That's how horror works. Yes?
The movie Bird Box comes to mind when I think of that.
What's it called?
Have you seen the movie Bird Box?
No.
I've seen it.
Does it work well that way?
Yeah, pretty much the monster is whatever your mind thinks of as the most horrid thing.
Yeah, whatever evokes terror. And what evokes terror is the privation of things. That evokes terror. Whatever suggests immensity or superpower, a power beyond our imagination, and whatever is unimaginable to us is terrifying. Death is a terrifying figure because even when he's described, he defies description. Milton's describing him, and he's describing him not only is he describing him, he's describing him as an agent. So there are two figures here. One's called sin, the other is called death. In James, it speaks of sin giving rise to death. But now Milton decides he's going to present sin and death as actual figures. Prime agents, and then we're going to find out where they came from, which is also very interesting. I'll come to that in just a second. Yes, and then...
The two figures is sin and death that he's explaining, but I've looked at a William Blake portrait of this book. It looks like death is fighting with the dragons, the dogs, and the woman, but Satan is kind of has a shield, but he's just shielding himself from sin and death because even he's so terrified by what he sees.
That's not how Milton portrays it, but yeah.
I mean, William Blake's aside.
Well, Blake's very interesting, but that's his imaginative representation of what he's reading there. But Milton's portrait is very interesting. So note that he also uses classical and other allusions. So to the Scylla and the Charybdis in the ancient classical epic, these are two terrible figures. You get caught between a rock and a hard place. That's Scylla and Charybdis. Either way, it's a horrible death. And you've got to, in the Odyssey, you got to go between the two of them. And don't go to one, don't go to the other. You're going to die. Portrayed here, and again, the sin is presented like a night hag or a Lapland witch, which, what do? They sacrifice infants at night. But she's worse than that. So he evokes the comparison only to say, it's worse than anything I can compare it to. Tries to think of the worst thing, and then says far worse, incomparable. Same thing with death. Death, he doesn't even bother that. There's no comparison he makes. That shows how terrible death is. There's no comparison there. And he says that Satan was now at hand, and from his seat the monster, moving onward, came as fast. Even that phrase, the monster. With horrid strides, hell trembled as he strode. The undaunted fiend, what this might be, admired. Admired, not feared, God and his Son except. Created thing not valued he nor shunned. And with disdainful look thus first began. So Satan is not afraid, because he's only afraid of God and his Son. That's the only thing he fears. This is a created being. He has no fear of this. But he admires it in the sense that he looks upon it and is shocked, dumbstruck, doesn't know what to do. And how does he respond? Who the heck are you? Whence and what art thou, execrable shape, that darest, though grim and terrible, advance thy miscreated front athwart, that is across my way, to yonder gates? Through them I mean to pass, that be assured, without leave asked of thee. Retire or taste thy folly, and learn by proof, hell-born, not to contend with spirits of heaven. So here's Satan. Death comes between him and the gates, and it's clear that death's not going to let him pass, and Satan is incensed. How dare you? Because you're a hellish creature, and I'm from heaven. So I'm going to pull one up on you. So now he pulls out the credentials. I'm a heaven-born, you're a hell-born, so you're superior. We're going to get the response to this right away, which is very interesting. Questions or comments? Yes?
Isn't that somewhat ironic, because death and sin are the offspring of Satan?
And we're going to come to that in a minute, but yes, they exactly are. Yes. Sure, yes.
Isn't that kind of Satan saying that creatures in heaven
Are superior to those? It is, of course.
but he's no longer?
No, I mean, he contradicts himself all the time, but you're right. He's just said that hell is just as good as heaven, and the mind is its own place. But then when he meets a foe, an adversary here, death, he immediately pulls out his credentials as heavenly born to put him down in his place. Well, language used by Satan is just a means to get an outcome. He lies all the time. He doesn't tell the truth. Everyone, this is what sinners do. They use language to manipulate an outcome. That's not what God does. God tells the truth. He never lies. Satan always lies because he's trying to manipulate to get the power that he doesn't have. When people follow Satan's footsteps, they do the same thing with their language. But every time they do so, it falls under the category of what we said about the Word of God, which is that an event happens. And in James 3, it says the tongue is a fire set on fire by hell. It's a thing that needs to be tamed. Yes?
So Satan speaking and deceiving is somewhat like him trying to create with his language?
He claims of it with his own mind that his reality lies in his head. It's not outward, it's inward. And his use of language is trying to construct that reality out of those lies. And to some degree, he's successful. When he is successful, the good is, when I talk about the privation of the good is hollowed out in some way. It loses some of its goodness. Lies are brought into the cosmos where there were none. Particularly when people follow his footsteps and lie and deceive and manipulate and seek power just like him and see their own greatness above others' greatness. They don't take the model of Christ, who is going to be humble and truthful. They take the model of Satan, who's going to be proud and deceitful. You get to choose. Yes?
He seems to be very intelligent, but would you say that he's very delusional in his ways?
He's delusional and capable of deluding. That's one of my questions always in the portrait here. How far does Satan drink his own Kool-Aid? Like, is he deceived by the things he says himself? Does he actually believe them? Or is he conscious of the fact that he's manipulating? And I'm not quite sure. And I'm not sure that when you lie, you're capable of making that discernment. This is the problem with lying. You start to believe what you have said because your words have a power to create an event, and you've got, in order to make it plausible, you got to act it out. But by acting it out, the old you that was there before the lie is no longer the you that's now lying. So how do you go back to that person that existed before the lie and was just deceiving? I think you've just fallen into your own trap. And I think the people that lie do precisely that. They're laying traps for others, but they themselves are falling in the trap they created and losing their identity in the process. But back to this great passage. He says, how dare you? And to whom the goblin, full of wrath, replied, Art thou that traitor angel? Art thou he who first broke peace in heaven and faith, till then unbroken and in proud rebellious arms drew after him the third part of heaven's sons, conjured against the highest? For which both thou and they, outcast from God, are here condemned to waste eternal days in woe and pain? And reckonest thou thyself with spirits of heaven, hell doomed, and breathe defiance here in scorn, where I reign king, and to enrage thee more, thy king and Lord? Back to thy punishment, false fugitive, and to thy speed add wings, lest with a whip of scorpions I pursue thy lingering, or with one stroke of this dart strange horror seize thee, and pangs unfelt before. So he gets down to hell, claims that he's now the sovereign and can do whatever he wants in hell, and then he finds out actually he is under the lordship of death. He can do nothing. He's powerless. Satan can't even leave hell because there's a gate there, and death guards the gate, and death is his master. So he's not even all-powerful in hell, never mind a full adversary of God. So the portrait of Satan is quite clear in Milton's theology, that he is not only not a counterpart to God, he's not even powerful in hell. Yes?
So then would sin and death in this kind of
Portrait.
personification be servants of God?
Everyone's a servant of God, because God's all-powerful. The question is, do they all serve his purposes for good? And the answer is, in some sense, yes, because he can bring out good out of evil. Does that mean he wants the fall to happen? In which case, God himself would seem to be the author of evil, in which case he's not good. So there lies the paradox and the conundrum. But yes, God is sovereign. When he's sovereign, even those that oppose him serve his will and his purposes. Does that mean that choice is not a real thing? Well, all these things will be addressed in Book 3, but these are theological problems. But they are part of the landscape that Milton portrays in Paradise Lost. But he grows in fire, and the two of them are about to fight. There's going to be a fight in hell, and there would have been no fight ever like it, until the snaky sorceress intervenes and says, "Oh, Father, what intends thy hand?" she cried, "against thy only son. What fury, O son, possesses thee to bend that mortal dart against thy father's head? And knowest for whom? For him who sits above and laughs, the while at thee ordained his drudge, to execute whate'er his wrath, which he calls justice, bids. His wrath, which one day will destroy ye both." Now look at that. Isn't that interesting? What's being said in this passage? We've got 10 lines. What is sin telling us about these two, and furthermore, about the final outcome of everything? Well, death is Satan's son. That makes him his father. Okay. Never recognized him before. He's awful. What an ugly shape you are. But the other thing is that both Satan and death will one day be destroyed in accordance with God's justice. So we know this before the fall has happened. Sin knows the outcome of all these things. And so does Satan, for that matter, because he's just been alerted to it, if he didn't know it before. God will be just, and he will not be defied. Not ultimately. There will be a time when sin and death have their reign, and Satan deceives, but it will not be all time. There will be an end to it, and God will put an end to it. That says it right there. We don't even need to wait for God to pronounce it. Sin has pronounced it, because she's heard it. She knows what she's there for. She has a time. Yes?
How come sin doesn't include herself in this passage?
Well, she doesn't, but she would be, yeah. Because sin and death are implicated. Yes?
What's the definition of death? Because it's not like Satan received death.
Are you me? Now you're asking the question. I asked it as well. What is death? What exactly is it? It's a hard question to answer. It really is. It's a profound question. You can describe it biologically. It's when, the organism stops breathing and the blood stops pumping. I mean, or the heart stops beating. There's no brain activity. There are various symptoms of a creature who's died. Right? And the coroner will come in and pronounce you dead. That person's dead. Okay, but what does that mean? It means they're not this anymore. Okay, that's the privation of those things. But it still doesn't answer the question of what death is. It's just privation of those symptoms. But what is life then? We have the answer to this is difficult. It's not difficult. It's impossible. We can't answer the question. Really, because the one who creates it defines the terms. And we're not our own authors. We're not our own creators. We don't create ourselves. Even if we have children, we don't create them either. Not really. I mean, procreation, yes, but we don't author their being. It's not something that we conceive and we control, but God does. So what is life? He's life, and he defines it. And therefore he defines death, and it's in opposition to him. But they're profound questions. They really are. Yes?
So then, is Sin or Milton then saying that death and Satan will cease to exist, like be annihilated?
Well, that's the language. He says they'll be destroyed.
Because that's in book 1 they're talking about basically almost like celebrating the idea of being annihilated. Like that would be better than kind of.
They would rather be annihilated than in the torment in which they exist, but that's because they can't imagine anything worse, which is why they're going to do it, which is actually going to bring about more wrath on them, we find. So the actions that Satan now undertakes are going to make things worse for him.
So being destroyed and being annihilated are different.
No, it's probably the same. But annihilating means there's nothing left. Nihil is nothing. So is there going to be an annihilation in the sense that nothing more will exist of that? Milton straddles the fence on that. But they'll be destroyed. Yeah, I don't know. Is that their power? Is that their existence? What exactly? God will make a new heaven and a new earth, and there will be no more sin, there'll be no more dying, there will be no more, right? So those things will be destroyed. Does that mean that it even says that Satan will, I guess? Leans towards annihilation. Yes?
Well, so does that mean that like dying is seen as a bad thing since it's the son of Satan? Like I'm just trying to wrap my mind. I'm just trying to understand this.
Good.
Like, because I know when people.
Well, dying's not a good thing.
But but then there's also times where if people have cancer or whatever, they see it as a good thing because they're no longer suffering, and plus they're going to go to heaven, which is a better place.
Well,
So-
some people think it is a good thing. Everyone thinks that the alleviation of suffering is a good thing. But actually, the alleviation of suffering is not a good thing. Health is a good thing. The alleviation of suffering is the removal of a bad thing, but that's not a good thing. I'm speaking philosophically.
Yeah.
But it's true. I mean, I don't want to be free of pain. I want to have health. That's the good thing. I want to be healthy. I want to enjoy that state of health. The sickness or the cancer is the absence of that state of health, which causes me pain. I don't want the pain anymore. But really, we don't do things for the sake of having no pain. We do it for the sake of the pleasurable aspects of being alive. But give me a choice, yeah, I'd rather not have any pain either. But it's not. No pain is not a good. pleasure is a good.
Mhm.
Health is a good. Right? So, did you follow at least once? I don't know the answer to your question exactly, but
I'm just trying to figure out.
you need to
if-
think about it philosophically in accordance with
Yeah.
the Augustinian view.
if dying is seen as a good thing.
It can be, because again, it depends how you see life. I was asked what life is. Life, everyone in this room is going to die. If the Lord does not return, everyone in this room is going to die. It's a perfect statistic. Every person who's ever lived is going. When they do die, what will be their life like after death? Modern science says that they're dead because they no have any bodily symptoms. Was that ever the definition of life, or was that only part of the definition of life? I think it was part of it, but was it the whole of it? I don't think so. In the Christian faith, there's a life after death, and how are you going to live that life, or where are you going to live life, or in relation to whom are you going to live that life? Are you going to live for yourself, or are you going to live for God?
Mhm.
If you live for yourself, then you're going to end up in hell, which is the privation of God. You're not going to have any of the benefits of God, in which case you're going to not be very happy, because your selfishness is actually going to destroy yourself. Whereas God says, even if you die, yet you will live. Because he defeats death, and there's an eternal life, and it's related to this life. These are all complex theological questions, and they're coming out of my text on Paradise Lost, which is extraordinary. This is why I love teaching Paradise Lost, because it's just really interesting.
I didn't answer my question.
I did, sort of?
You
Okay.
did.
Good. Okay. Good. Yes.
Drawing on what you said about the afterlife part, how should Christians view death in terms of like the definition of it? Even like when Jesus was talking to, I don't remember if it was Martha or Mary about Lazarus and saying that he was only sleeping. Do
Yes.
we consider our body dead, but then our souls? Does our soul ever really die? So is that do we have to consider ourselves dead?
Yeah, now you're getting into all sorts of, these are going away from my text. Maybe I can
Sorry.
I can duck out by saying that's got nothing to do with Paradise Lost. It's a serious question. What exactly happens then? What is that? And what happens to the soul? The soul and the body are distinct, but they're united in biblical understanding, right? Because there's a unity there. There's a distinction, but a unity. When the body dies, what happens to the soul? That's a theological question, and I will punt that, as I say, because I'm never going to get through my book if I try to answer all these questions. But that one's not an easy one to answer even. And there are various responses that have been given to that question. One more, and then I'm going to proceed and try and finish. No, sorry, back behind you. Yeah.
I think it has to do with the way you die and the way you live, because Belial says, Almighty Victor Spenos ranged and Lastendas, they're developing, before they decide to reverse man instead of destroy them or wage another war, they're developing a self-deprecating attitude, like they want to be annihilated or they enjoy the pain of being ungodly. So something like suicide or living a way that causes premature death, purposely, self-deprecating things like that. It should be seen as like when she was talking about cancer, it's not.
It's a great question. So I get what you're saying. So the question of what is life? If you're going to die, then how does that and yet how is that going to change how you live your life? Well, some might be, I want to live it to its fullest while it's here. Well, that just begs the question: what does it mean to live life to its fullness? And then it begs the question of, well, what do we mean by life? And Jesus says that he is the way, the truth, and the life. Right? He who believes in him will never die. Even though he dies, he will live. He will be raised up to eternal life. He's the author of life. He represents life. He swallows up death when he dies on the cross. So he, to some extent, defines life, or in the only extent that we really can speak of it meaningfully. And therefore, this life needs to be lived in the life in the light of the life of the one who is the resurrection and the life. And therefore, so a bit of an answer to it. But if you live in contradiction to that, there will be a contradiction when you die. That life that you live will be lived in denial of the very person who is life, and will lack all of the goodness that comes with the author of life. That's the best answer, short answer on a very profound question. But back to this I want to talk about how they came about, because Satan says, what are you talking about? I never saw, I know thee not, it says to her, nor ever saw till now, sight more detestable than him and thee. It's not very friendly. To whom thus the portress of Hellgate replied, hast thou forgot me then? And do I seem now in thine eyes so foul, once deemed so fair in heaven, when at the assembly and in sight of all the seraphim with thee combined in bold conspiracy against heaven's king, all in a sudden miserable pain surprise thee, dim thine eyes and dizzy swum in darkness, while thy head flames thick and fast threw forth, till on the left side opening wide, likest to thee in shape and countenance bright, then shining heavenly fair, a goddess armed out of thy head I sprung. Now, does that remind you of any creature, mythology? No? Athena. Athena springs out of Zeus's head. That's how she comes into being. Sin pops out of Satan's head in heaven. How does that happen? Satan is beholding the Son being honored by the Father, and he's envious. He thinks he deserved to be honored by God. In his pride, he thinks that he ought to be reigning in heaven. And from that moment on, sin exists. It pops into existence. It's a thought in his head. Now it springs out of his head like a goddess, looking like him, his mirror image, and then he admires her. All the host of heaven back they recoiled afraid at first, and called me sin. And for a sign portentous held me, but familiar grown I pleased, and with attractive graces won the most averse, thee chiefly, who full oft thyself in me thy perfect image viewing. So he's a narcissist. Why did he love sin? Because sin was a lot like him. It represented who he was in relation to God. And he loved her, and then he did love her. He had an amorous event in heaven, tried to keep it secret, and then she became pregnant, and then the love child in heaven is death, and it breaks out of her womb, and from the wreckage there, she's not born, it just breaks through, and then through the wreckage the scaly folds come out, and that's death. And then death chases her around trying to eat her, because he's got no food, and death is ravenous. He's trying to eat his mother, and he would eat her, except he knows that when sin dies, he'll die, because death follows sin. So if you destroy sin, you destroy death, so he can't eat her. So it's a horrible portrait of sin and death. This is how they come about. They all come from Satan. Now we have the infernal trinity: Satan, sin, and death. It is a sort of an infernal trinity. Now Milton, to some degree, constructs this, but it's fascinating. And now I'll come to the question. She acquaints them with who they are. This is your son. This is your dad. Don't kill him. That will make God happy. Don't kill him, because you can't, and he's got a dart there, and you don't want to taste that dart. Whatever, you might not be able to die, but something's going to happen. You won't like it. And they let him out. They open the gates of hell, and they get up, because they have the permission from heaven to do so. Now, this is problematic, but final question or comment before I...
So if God's perfect and everything he creates is perfect, and nothing evil comes from God, then how did like this thought of evil of sin spring into
If God is perfect, then how could this ever happen, that an evil thought should transpire? Because the creatures have free will. And free will means being able to choose something other than God. Otherwise, there's no freedom there. Satan chooses of his own accord to rebel against God.
But before Satan, how would they know there wasn't evil?
They would know theoretically that the choice exists, but why would anyone ever want to choose it? Because why would you choose anything other than the good? And what God is everything good. Why would you want anything other than that? It's a pervert. Why would Satan ever do this? I don't know. But how he could do it, because he had the freedom to choose to do so. And he exhibited that by doing that. So this is the high price of freedom, is the capacity to choose something other than what is plainly good and even in your own self-interest. This is the stupidest thing anyone ever could conceivably ever do, what Satan did, or think. But he did think it. Once he thinks it, there are consequences. And God exhibits the fact that he's not a tyrant, and he allows creatures to have freedom by allowing them to rebel. So is God the author of the sin then, or is it the creatures who had the freedom to rebel? And I think unless it's a fake freedom, they have to have the capacity to rebel, and they did. And the Bible's the account of precisely that. That's what happened. How is it possible? Because of freedom. Do we blame God for that? It's a hard one. Again, did he will it? No. Did he know it? Yes. All problems. Anyway, I'll look at book 3 next time. We'll move on to 4, and then I'll dip into book 9. Okay?